kind of greater Boston area in Massachusetts. And I'm a member of the state legislative committee for American Immigration Lawyers Association of New England. And one of our greatest hits this year has been doing a series where we're highlighting other New England states outside of Massachusetts and talking about the immigrant community, what ICE enforcement looks like, and really speaking to specialists with their boots on the ground. And so with that, Melinda, did you put the bios in the chat?
Yeah, but it will do it right now.
Okay, perfect. So we're going to pop the speakers' bios in the chat so we can jump right into the conversation. But if everyone, or actually if the speakers just want to introduce themselves just really briefly and say where they work, I think that would be great. So let's start with you, Jill.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Jill Martin Diaz, pronouns they, them. I'm the Executive Director of Vermont Asylum Assistance Project, and I'm also very lucky to be on the AILA State Advocacy Committee.
I want to pass it. Let's do Devin.
Hey everyone, I'm Devin O'Brien, pronouns she, her. I'm an immigration community lawyer with Vermont Legal Aid, working on the community lawyering initiative with the Vermont Asylum Assistance Project.
Let's pass it to your colleague, Daniel.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. I'm Daniel Schmidt. I'm a staff attorney with Vermont Legal Aid and a community immigration lawyer working in partnership with Vermont Asylum Assistance Project. And my pronouns are he, him. Thanks very much.
And we have Falco.
Hi, everyone. Falco Schilling. Pronouns are he, him, and I'm the Advocacy Director for the American Civil Liberties Union of Vermont.
Let's see who else. We have Maggie. Oh no, Maggie's having mic issues. See if we can get that fixed. Maggie is a practice development fellow with the Vermont Asylum Assistance Project and is kind of starting policy work after many years of working directly with immigrants. And then do we have Jordan or did Jordan? No, Jordan.
No, that's it. We're stacked.
Perfect. So we are going to start with an overview and a discussion of who composes the immigrant community in Vermont. So Devin and Daniel, I'll pass it over to you to kick off.
Do you want to go first, Dan?
However you prefer, Devin.
Okay. I'll start us off then. So just to preface this, I'm new to immigration practice. I'm also new to the state of Vermont. As I mentioned, I work for Vermont Legal Aid as a community lawyer. And so I cover the southern part of Vermont. And what we do is we work really closely with community-based organizations who really have their ears to the ground in terms of who is there, what the challenges are, and what their legal needs are. So for this is a bit anecdotal, but one of the community-based organizations that I work with, in terms of the profile of their clientele, I would say over half are from Latin American countries, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Honduras. There's also other folks from Russia, Afghanistan, Sudan. So it really kind of runs the gamut in terms of nationalities. And in terms of the legal postures they find themselves in, it's also very diverse. And so we have asylum seekers, we have resettled folks who need to adjust their status. And I would actually say that in terms of the biggest legal need that we are seeing, it's a lot of people who need legal assistance to apply for green cards. And so that is work that we are focused on as well. When we look at the immigrant community in that part of the state, like what are some of the challenges? Apart from needing legal assistance, we have a lack of affordable housing and also lack of affordable transportation because there are a lot of public transportation gaps. In addition to that, people tend to be employed in sectors like manufacturing, retail services, construction, agriculture. So really a wide variety of folks in the immigrant community. There's no predominant nationality. As a new immigration attorney, it's really a cool experience to be able to get my feet wet, working with a bunch of different folks on a bunch of different issues.
Thanks, Devin, for that very thorough introduction and overview. So yeah, like Devin said, I think Vermont has a really diverse immigrant community. A lot of people from South and Central America. There's also a lot of, I believe, Canadians and Europeans, as well as people from Africa and Asia. So really from all over the world. And yeah, as Devin said, supporting a variety of industries. Probably most known are like the dairy industry and construction, although other farms and other industries certainly rely on immigrant labor as well. Like Devin, I'm also excited to be getting involved in immigration work and learning this area of the law. I don't know that my current docket is necessarily representative of the Vermont immigrant community's identity and needs. But so far, what I'm seeing is primarily people from South and Central America, mostly Ecuador and Mexico. I do have a couple people from a Western African nation. And most of the issues that I've come up with so far has been around asylum applications and the standby guardianships for minor immigrant children or children of immigrant minors.
Could you
And
explain
there's
what
other
a
issues as well. I'm sorry?
could you explain what a standby guardianship is? I don't think that exists in every state.
Absolutely. So the idea is when parents have, undocumented status or are otherwise at risk of an adverse immigration, like detention or deportation, they can set up what's called a standby guardianship or a springing guardianship. If they can identify a community member, a family neighbor, or otherwise who they trust, who has more secure immigration status, we can go ahead and execute legal documents, setting up a power of attorney, and preparing documents to file for a guardianship with the state courts so that in the event the parents are detained and or deported, this will save the child from being put into DCF custody. The child can stay with someone they know, someone they're familiar with, someone who can maintain their routines, and someone who's committed to a plan to reunite the child with their parents, whatever that may look like, depending on their specific circumstances. So we've definitely seen some demand for setting up those.
Awesome. And now let's maybe turn a little bit. Maggie, is your mic working?
I hope so. Can you hear me now? Yay, I fixed
Yeah.
it. Okay.
So Maggie was going to talk a little bit about ICE enforcement in Vermont and what they're seeing in regards to detention dynamics.
Sure. So VAAP spends some time in the two facilities where ICE detainees are held. Up until very recently, that was the women's facility in South Burlington, but that's not being used as much anymore. Men are detained at the Northwest facility in Swanton, Vermont. And so we're seeing folks detained there. The population ranges from 5 or 6 people to upwards of 18 at a time. But we are seeing folks moved pretty frequently. So, for example, we just had a client on Tuesday with a pending bond hearing who got moved out of state yesterday. And so we had to kind of scramble to track that person down so we could continue talking with them and continue preparing for their bond hearing, which we'd already committed to do. So we're certainly seeing folks who are detained don't have a lot of hope that they will stay where they are for very long. I think, and perhaps my colleagues can chime in if they've seen differently, but I think the longest stay we're sort of seeing for most folks is about a month, and then they may be moved elsewhere.
And Jill, did you want to share a little bit about what was happening with the women's facility in Vermont and why it's not being used as much?
Oh, Emmylou, I think you're muted.
Oh,
Oh, no, I could hear you, Emily. Yeah, absolutely. So, um, we lack any federal facilities here in Vermont. That's by statute, statute that was passed, I believe, during the first Trump administration, before I was practicing in New England. And we have a 287G related contract in which the federal marshals allow ICE to use marshal space in state facilities to hold in custody ICE detainees because CRCF, the Chittenden Regional Women's Facility, happens to be one of the only women's facilities in the region. It was becoming, a very high kind of traffic zone. What we were seeing in our facilities is not just folks who were originally detained in Vermont or even necessarily were living in Vermont, but just being transferred here, presumably because of bed space and a documented pattern we've noted across the bar of ICE seeming to deliberately want to separate people from their counseling community to try and encourage them to self-deport. And we, until recently, were seeing lots of women from all over the world in our facility here. And we were able to serve them, like do intake and consultation in a clinic style setting. But we have been working to resolve some prisoners' rights issues and legal access issues impacting ICE detainees in Vermont DOC custody. DOC, we're in a conciliatory posture now. They're represented by the Vermont Attorney General's office. Things are going well. Lots of good remediations happening, but something that we were concerned about when we decided to seek out accountability to redress systems level prisoners' rights issues that were impacting people's access to lawyers in court was making it so burdensome to house people that maybe then the housing would start to taper off. And what we understand now is that the women's facility in Vermont does not plan on accepting new ICE detainees unless the state is below a certain threshold of people who are in post-conviction custody on a given day. And so the silver lining of our advocacy work, along with partners at ACLU of Vermont and the Human Rights Commission, is that we're improving language access and legal access. We're making sure that pro se litigants are appearing for their hearings and not being, facing risk of an abstention removal orders. Lots of good stuff. But now, I don't know if the two things are related. They just happen to be temporally close in time that those developments occurred. We are seeing an average of 10 or less, around 10 men in ICE custody in the men's state facility in Swanton on any given day. And we're continuing to receive calls for intake through our main coordinated intake line, as well as offer intake with boots on the ground clinic style consult services a couple times a month. Right now, the rates of new detentions on the VAAP intake line, we're seeing over the last couple of months anywhere between 1 and 5 new requests for detained legal help coming through main intake. Some of those folks are folks who happen to be driving in Vermont. We get a surprising number of GPS accidentally took me to Canada cases. And so we will get calls for help from people who were detained in Vermont but are not otherwise Vermont based. And we'll explore remedies for them or get them in contact with their local counsel at home. A lot of you on this call provide information sharing with us in your regions, and we're happy to repay the favor. So thank you so much for being such great collaborators. And then, as the other lawyers on the panel noted, we continue to receive a normal amount of lots of new requests for other types of immigration legal help every week. But that's what the ICE activity in Vermont seems to look like. We're seeing a lot of my GPS accidentally took me to Canada cases. We're seeing some asylum seeking in Canada where people get turned back under the Safe Third Country Agreement lawfully or sometimes not lawfully, sometimes in error. We're seeing a lot of opportunistic driving while brown racial profiling cases. We have almost all of Vermont is within the 100-mile border zone, except for a small area clustered around Manchester. Migrant Justice did a GIS of the 100-mile border zone, and it's like almost the whole state. So, and everything's really rural and distant. So just acts like driving to school, to work, to come to me, to my office for legal services, puts people at risk of encounters. And we do meet a lot of people who are just kind of like picked up at the gas station, at Western Union, at Shaw's, things like that. There was a really big concern in Vermont during and following the Maine surge, the Portland Maine surge, that like this would be the next blue bastion for ICE to rove to. That's not quite what happened. I know that there was quite a bit of national media attention paid to the March 11th Dorset Street ICE action, which we can talk about a little later. But that was that kind of action. I think what was noteworthy from the media's perspective was the amount of amazing solidarity, community togetherness in response to the action. But there's a lot of kind of routine ICE enforcement actions that happen week to week that kind of go unreported.
Awesome. Thank you for that very detailed overview. Let's talk a little bit now about habeas and federal litigation in Vermont. I know there's been some really good decisions coming out of Vermont. What are the courts and judges like? And like, what are the strategies that folks are using with habeas? Maggie or Jill?
Sure, I can talk a little bit about that. I will say I've just second chaired a habeas case, which was really exciting. So overall, I think the judges in Vermont are extremely receptive to these cases and are kind of slowly sort of realizing that immigration court, the way that the immigration court is trending, it's not really giving the relief that folks are entitled to. So a lot of the judges, when they receive a habeas petition, we've had clients sort of get immediate release, which is ideal. Some cases referred back to immigration court for a bond hearing, and we've obtained bond that way. Just to answer the question in the chat, there actually is not an immigration court in Vermont. Our closest one is Chelmsford, and sometimes cases are heard in Boston, but if you're represented, you can participate in the hearing remotely on WebEx. But my understanding is that pro se's, I think, have to go in person. So the habeas that I second chaired was actually assigned to a federal judge in Rutland. And I think that was a little bit of an outlier. That judge really wanted the case sent back to immigration court and wasn't prepared to rule on the habeas until that had happened. So that sort of was breaking with the trend, but and our client ended up getting bonded out. So the habeas case resolved that way since our client was able to get released. But Vermont seems to have been getting a bit of a reputation for having judges who are very receptive to habeas petitions and who are sort of recognizing the trend of immigration courts. So I think our district is getting a great reputation for hearing habeas petitions.
And is there, Jill, could you speak about like how habeas petitions, like how immigrants get connected to habeas counsel in Vermont?
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll either hear about a newly detained person through our main intake or through Facebook and Instagram and text messages, because it's a small town here in Vermont, and we all know each other. Or we will encounter someone when we're doing a detention center visit. We'll do an assessment about whether there are arguments to be made that the underlying detention, the way it was effectuated or the way it's currently being managed, is illegal, is violating the person's constitutional or civil rights that would give rise to a petition. And we will, ACLU of Vermont, I know Falco is a lobbyist, but Falco's colleagues on the litigation team were the ones who created the District of Vermont model with Rumeza Ozturk and Moza Madawi. And then that was like the celebrity gold standard cases. And the other lawyers on the panel have been working ever since to figure out how to scale the model. And we're very fortunate because we do have such a deep bench here in Vermont. We have district court offices in Burlington and Rutland. And all the judges seem to rotate hearing habeas complaints, and more the judges are willing to not just remand to immigration court for bond hearings, but to have bail hearings in court, or to just order release on recognizance from the bench. The district seems to be taking very seriously the constitutional and civil rights violations that we're documenting. There are people who we learn of through intake or through our visits who get moved quicker than we can file a habeas, and then we're at kind of the whim of the national network, or people who really we can't find a colorable argument for the illegality of their detention because the laws are so draconian. So it's not really for everyone. But a huge boon to our capacity has been welcoming Vermont into the Habeas Project of New England, which started in Massachusetts and added Maine, and partners have been growing, and we were the most recent addition, and it's been incredible to link up the immigration lawyers you see on this panel with pro bono habeas co-counsel, who we connect with through the Habeas Project.
I don't know if you have thoughts on this, but there's a question in the chat. Are there thoughts about the news that the head of ICE met with Border Protection and Patrol in Vermont this week?
I just saw that story this morning during my morning scroll. So I don't know the deets yet, and I don't have thoughts, but this is a round table, and I see a lot of people in here who have thoughts.
I see a twinkle in Falco's eye.
I mean, yeah, no, I have thoughts, and it's been interesting. I mean, I don't think it's great news, but I think as Jill was saying, there's been a lot of attention paid to what happened in Dorset, on Dorset Street in South Burlington, and the level of cooperation and assistance from state and local authorities. I mean, I would not be surprised if just the number of statements, the number of public hearings, the number of everything that's happened around this prompted more conversations there, especially just around ongoing border work and state of collaboration between the state of Vermont and ICE and Border Patrol. You know, we've seen our governor generally position themselves, trying to kind of straddle the fence when it comes to these issues, where they're explicitly trying to not antagonize members of federal administration, while at the same time trying to reassure folks here in Vermont that they're here to protect us, and they're here to protect our communities, and their involvement in these actions is solely based on that. So I don't know if it's more just kind of reiterating commitments to each other or anything else, or it didn't seem like it was a major warning about coming actions, but we don't know. But yeah, no, that didn't seem like good news.
Actually, and Emily, what I might suggest is Devin and Daniel, I'm curious to hear from you folks as like the boots on the ground. Like, what are you hearing in the community-based orgs, you know, in the circles that you run in and provide services in? How is the ICE, you know, the news of the Border Czar's visit or Dorset Street fallout coming up in your practice?
So I haven't actually spoken with anyone about the head of ICE meeting with Border Patrol and Protection here in Vermont yet, but yeah, the event on March 11th on Dorset Street was definitely concerning, I think, for people for a number of reasons. Partly to do with, you know, these collateral arrests, that none of the people who were actually detained were even on the warrant that justified entry to the house, and also with the conduct of the state and local police. As I think Falco was saying, there's sort of this idea that they're there to protect the Vermonters, but that was, I think, not how that was experienced by many of the Vermonters who were there on the scene that day.
I would echo that as well. And I think the March 11th event definitely exacerbated people's fears, and rightly so. And I think kind of the very real fear and risk that people have is also like combining with a lot of misinformation that is often floating around. And I find a lot of the conversations I have with people are kind of like, is this true? Is this true? I saw this. Is this true? And it's, as we all know, it's really hard to keep on track, like keep on top of things that are actually happening versus what is just a rumor. As we know, often like a lot of informal channels are how real information does get passed. And so um, there's a lot of confusion in general, a lot of confusion and fear is what I'm seeing.
Yeah. And does anyone else have kind of lasting thoughts on the March 11th event on Dorset Street? I know we've kind of talked maybe around directly what happened, but for Jill, do you want to give a short overview for those who might not be as in the know?
Or we received notice on March 11th that there was another, like what we think nowadays of as a kind of routine, opportunistic attempt to arrest someone without a warrant. ICE thought that they were pursuing someone that they were looking for. They arrived, they followed a person to a house where they did not have a warrant. And because we've done such a good job of know your rights in our community, folks felt empowered to ask ICE to clarify if they had a warrant and to identify themselves, held them accountable to the Fourth Amendment. There was a call to action put out, lots of mutual aid providers, legal observers, accompaniment providers, several lawyers who were on this call were boots on the ground. I was not. And there was kind of an all-day standoff while ICE went to the District of Vermont, to the magistrate judge, to seek a warrant, which they ended up obtaining. Entered the home, opportunistically arrested 3 other non-citizens who were in the home, who were not the people they were looking for. And in Vermont, something that this will be a nice segue into state legislative updates. In Vermont, one of our previous legislative achievements has been passage of the Fair and Impartial Policing Policy, or the FIP. The FIP was created by statute. There's a model FIP. And the requirement is that every law enforcement agency in the state has some kind, adopts a FIP that at least meets the minimum standards set by the model policy, with oversight from the Attorney General's office and the Criminal Justice Council, which is a state-based committee. The short of it is, Vermonters can rest assured that our law enforcement agencies cannot, will not affirmatively share any resources or information in service of federal law enforcement, period. And of course, as we know, law enforcement have always, they reserve an amount of discretion that comes in the form of their feelings. Like they get to if they feel threatened, that is a fact that supports use of force or deviation from lots of protections that we put in place. So there's a lot of debate over whether the Fair and Impartial Policing Policy goes as far as it needs to provide meaningful help. I'm not an expert on the FIP. I'm not qualified to speak on it, but what I will say is it's been a really useful tool as an immigration lawyer to help foster trust from communities, especially harmed people who might need to call emergency services for help, to reassure people it is safe to engage with help that you need, and you don't need to fear immigration consequences as a result. But because 3 different law enforcement agencies, Burlington, South Burlington, and Vermont State Police, appeared on Dorset Street, and lots of footage, lots of live tweeting, lots of documentation of what went down. Whether or not there was a FIP violation, according to those agencies' policies, there's definitely been a significant erosion of community trust in local law enforcement. And my perception is, as someone who works co-counseling with many on this call, representing in the habeas relief and now removal proceedings of the 3 individuals collaterally arrested, unfortunately, the discourse, like we as a community have been very focused on kind of what happened within our community that day. And in my humble opinion, not enough focus on the illegal conduct of ICE and the impact on the three non-citizen youth who were picked up. So, it's just an interesting example of how these really creative state-based solutions that we cook up in the State House, how they can kind of play out and what the learnings are as we go ahead. But the good news is all three folks walked free pursuant to habeas relief. The District of Vermont said, no, ICE, that was illegal. And they all have representation in their removal proceedings.
And I also want to elevate Barbara Prine's comment here that they were able to use a power of attorney form that the mother had filled out through VLA's Immigrant Minor Guardianship Project to get a child out of the house prior to ICE like aggressively going in. So maybe potential ideas for kind of preempting harm in the future as well. And I love to see when like clinic projects like that provide real protection in the moment. And you can see that this was such a collaboration of organizations working together to help these immigrants. So let's turn it over, Falco. Barbara, did you want to share something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, ICE was not helpful, and the local law enforcement were not helpful about recognizing the guardianship. The school district was very helpful in recognizing the power of attorney, and the protesters were helpful in recognizing the power of attorney as a way to get the child out of the house. But law enforcement was both local law enforcement and ICE were completely non-helpful. The best thing is it was clear who had the authority to take the child out through the power of attorney form in a very stressful situation. So that was the big thing that happened.
Awesome. Thanks for that context, Barbara. And let's kind of in the vein of the FIP and talking about the legislative kind of ground in Vermont. Falco, if you want to give us kind of an overview of what immigrant protections are in place in Vermont and was on the agenda this year.
Yeah, happy to talk a little bit more about all of that. So ACLU Vermont and our allies, many of which are on this call, have been working to try and pass stronger protections for immigrant communities through our legislative process for a number of years. I've been with the ACLU Vermont since 2019, so I've worked on a number of these, but before my time, the fair and partial policing policy was one of those premier pieces of policy that our legal director, Leah Ernst, really was lead in our office and helping push through, along with collaboration with folks from Migrant Justice. To Jill's point, we've never said it's good enough. It's been a constant point of tension ever since, and there's been a number of things that we've been pushing for, especially things like allowing for municipalities to actively affirm that they will not share things like immigration status with federal authorities. We have some disagreement with our Attorney General's office about the statute's abilities to do that, which we think is pretty clear, but have been, worked through the committee process and been continually trying to strengthen that. But I do think what we saw on Dorset Street poked some of the holes in that policy, things like where there might be a should as opposed to a shall, and that might make all the difference. Things like you should not facilitate federal authorities making arrests for removal as opposed to you shall not. But anyway, that is, I think in many situations has had a really positive effect on collaboration between local law enforcement and federal immigration authorities, just reducing that level of cooperation, making people think twice, and really clearly delineating things like use of facilities and other things. So limiting that amount of cooperation. So I do think that has had a positive effect. Other really important protections that have been in place for a while, even before my time at the ACLU, is Vermont offers driver privilege cards to folks without having to prove citizenship status, which was a huge win from a number of years ago, which is also aimed at freedom of movement, letting folks fully, participate within society and not having to fear being, pulled over and then not being able to show that they have any sort of legal authority to be driving on the road. So those are two things that have been in place for a while. In 2003, we and our allies were part of helping pass pass a ban on courthouse arrests for civil courthouse arrests based off of laws that existed in New York State, which at that point in time, this was not as much of a hot button issue as it is now. And we're able to get that through, including prohibitions on arresting folks traveling to and from courthouses. That law has yet to be challenged in court, and from our understanding from folks on the ground, has had an actual impact where we are seeing, previously we would see a number of enforcement actions happening in Vermont courthouses, and that just really hasn't been the practice in recent years. So those are some of the positive things. Last year, I will say that as we started the year and we're talking to folks about some of the priorities we had coming both from our ACLU National and just looking at what was happening here on the ground, immigration protections were top of our list, but they didn't gain the type of attention that I think that they really deserved until we saw the detention of Ramesa Ozturk and Mosa Madawi. And then quite suddenly there was a lot of interest within the building about trying to make some more things happen. And so last year we got a number of things passed, including the standby guardianship provisions that you've been hearing quite a lot about. We also added immigration as a protected class within our housing laws and removed requirements that folks submit social security numbers to be considered for housing. And we also extended the ability to renew driver privilege cards, so folks are not having to submit new applications, concerns about how that might work within interactions with federal authorities. So those are some of the things we were able to get through last year, but going into this year, we came together in a more concerted way with folks at VAAP, Migrant Justice, our national offices, support groups like VPIRG, and put together a little bit more of a comprehensive agenda trying to address some of the bigger holes that we were concerned about. And that kind of focused on a couple key points. And I will say off the bat, we've had some really good progress in this legislative session. Things like expanding protections on sensitive locations. So S208 is a bill which has passed our Senate, is up on the House floor for a vote tomorrow. And that expands the ban on courthouse arrest to other public buildings, and in particular government-owned buildings. So all government-owned buildings, and then other sensitive locations such as DMVs, schools, hospitals, places of worship, where the remedy for that is that folks, if there is an arrest that happens within these spaces, folks under Vermont law will have the ability to bring a civil action against the arresting officers for false imprisonment and other damages. So that is one bill that has been working its way through and we think has a really good chance of passing. One that we're really excited about here at the ACLU is our Converse 1983 bill, our Constitutional Accountability Act, which was actually passed into law just a few weeks ago. So this is a bill that takes the Section 1983 and liability for state and local officers and applies it to federal officers as well. We've seen similar bills like this be used in places like Maine, where we just saw that they filed suit based on a similar state law that they have against some federal officers arising out of the actions that happened in and around Portland. So we're very excited about that and starting to look at opportunities for potential cases when that bill becomes good law on July 1st. But that was a really big win and one that I know our national office was really excited about because it avoided a number of the other concerns we saw in other states. Talking to folks in Massachusetts, you have a very similar version of this already within state law, so that's pretty exciting. And I'd be interested to know if folks are thinking about or how to use that or might want to use that. Beyond that, one of the big pushes of this year was to move us closer to a system of universal representation. So we worked together to get a bill introduced to make sure that anyone who is detained in a Vermont facility would have access to counsel. It was policy that a lot of folks thought was a really good idea, but inevitably, as folks who do legislative work will recognize, once it came to the money, that's when things got a lot harder. And we ran into some more roadblocks, but happy to say that the House passed a budget that included $200,000 to support work happening at Legal Aid for immigrant defense. The Senate scaled that back some and made cuts in other areas, which we're not happy about, but that looks like it's going to move forward in one way or another, and we're still advocating for that. So that's a big win from this year. S227 is another sensitive locations bill that's focused more specifically on schools and relies more on schools asserting their rights to not let folks into non-public spaces. It also, so it says that Vermont schools, we're not going to allow civil immigration arrests within our facilities, and make sure schools have policies in place around how to deal with immigration enforcement in the schools, and puts in place more protections around schools, which is really exciting. And then beyond that, I think I've gone through most of them. The one that I think has been garnering a lot of attention, and interestingly, is less directly related to immigration itself, but more police accountability and things that have arisen out of so many of these enforcement actions. Is we had a proposed bill for law enforcement identification requirements and a ban on masking, unless it's necessary under certain circumstances. That had been chugging along and honestly had been the thing that folks were the most interested in when I started talking to them beginning of the session. And we very much took a kind of yes and approach, that we want to be supportive of folks that want to make sure law enforcement is properly ID'd, but also make sure folks knew about other pressing needs for folks in immigrant communities beyond just making sure that law enforcement is properly identified and unmasked. So that passed our Senate, and just yesterday passed out of our House Judiciary Committee, but they've eliminated all liability for federal officers in this because they got scared due to a decision that came out of the Ninth Circuit around California's No Vigilantes Act. So we are continuing to push them to, we think we think it's a much closer call on constitutionality than the Ninth Circuit did, and think we have strong arguments to advance it. So we're continuing to push the legislature to move it forward and include federal officers, regardless of that decision, which is not controlling, but obviously persuasive. And so those are kind of some of the big balls that are up in the air in terms of work in the legislature. And I guess one more, Jill, I know you want me to put a plug in for that we actually testified on last week, is our comprehensive data privacy bill, which is S71, recognizing the role that ad tech plays in the mass surveillance state, and the fact that ICE is out there looking for off-the-shelf tools to improve their surveillance practices from folks who are already surveilling us because of what we buy or where we visit online. This bill, we think, would be really helpful because it requires data minimization on the front end so that folks are not having to give over more data than that's necessary for the service they're getting. It allows folks to opt out more easily, limit targeted advertising, delete their personal data from databases, and then also has strong, enforcement mechanism through our AG. We'd love to see it back as a private right of action, but generally limiting that collection of data on the front end from private sources, which then can be used as a workaround for the Fourth Amendment, is something that's a big concern and one of the big reasons we're supporting that bill. We'll see how it comes out in the end. A version of this has already been vetoed by our governor, supposedly over the private right of action, but I think there might be other larger concerns coming from industry that might be persuasive there. But that's something we're seeing still in the mix. So a lot of good things still in the mix. Really excited about our Converse 1983 statute already being signed into law. But also it was a good year to get folks' attention and willingness to move on issues that they might not have moved on in the past or have been thinking about. And we're already starting to think a little bit more about what might be coming up next year and what might still be on the table. So that's kind of the report from the legislature. I hope that was not too long-winded and boring.
No, and I was going to ask Maggie if you wanted to share kind of what you're hearing as priorities in the immigrant community for what, sort of protections they would like that maybe have failed this year or that haven't even been introduced formally, because I know you're in a kind of a unique role being in collaboration with a lot of community orgs, but also working on some ledge stuff.
Yeah, honestly, Falco did a really great job. I don't have a ton to add to Falco. I think Jill may know more about things that are up and coming. I will also just add there was one other bill that Falco touched upon for allowing sort of Vermonters to sue federal officers for violations of their constitutional rights. And that's really not just a made up thing. I went to a press conference with VPIRG where a woman who was at the March 11th protests on Dorset Street talked about her direct experience being strangled by a police officer until she lost consciousness. So that's happening to a citizen. So to have the option to sue when you've been harmed is really meaningful. So I think it's really interesting to hear about all these legislative proposals and priorities, and then to hear from someone who's going to really be able to benefit from that, who had a real, really violent experience, be able to get some relief is really satisfying. So I think that's great. But for up and coming things, I might pass that to Jill, who's got a much better sense of that.
Thanks, Maggie. And I'm glad that you said that, because my cold dead heart, I'm so desensitized at this point. I've been doing detain work for about 10 years. And so I'm glad you said that. I did not mean to minimize how absolutely harmful and violent and awful March 11th was. I've observed many additional acts of violence on the part of ICE against our immigrant and citizen communities here that go unreported or unaddressed by the powers that be in our state. So it's all bad. And I highly recommend going through and watching the testimony. Our community was so incredibly generous, not just the 3 individuals who were impacted, but all of the first responders who flooded the State House and flooded Burlington City Council and really made a record of what their experiences were on March 11th. People are really incredible. I love this community. I don't think that Falco's presentation was boring at all, because the other ledge stuff that I have to talk about, I think, is boring. It's about systems and structures. Folks from other states might be interested to know that Vermont, even though we have this amazing group of advocates and community partners, we do not have formal organizing structures. There is no civil society lead organization like AMIRA or the New York Immigration Coalition in New York that helps to bring us all together to get organized and to cross-pollinate and collaborate. We do all of that. That's kind of an externality in our system. And we are still, in our decentralized way, working to try and create some coordination capacity, starting with the state government. So in 2025, the legislature agreed to conduct a study on the potential need for a state-based Office of New Americans in Vermont. That study is happening right now. Because I cannot help myself, VAAP and a consulting firm, Riverland Strategies, are simultaneously publishing our own white paper to complement the ONA study. Because if we don't get some state skin in the game next session, I'm gonna cry. So next biennium, we are absolutely going to be prioritizing standing up some state-based capacity. We also have our foot in the door for state-based appropriations for the first time in our state's history. So exciting that we've been able to partner with Vermont Legal Aid, which is now hosting these 2 amazing community lawyers that you've heard from today in a 1-year pilot. And right now, the budget for FY27 includes an appropriations line item to sustain one of the 2 positions into next financial year, and we're going to raise the rest. So it's the first time in our state's history that we have a budget line item for immigration legal services. So really, it's a testament to all the incredible work that all the people you've heard from here and in the chat that made that happen. So thank you all. And then what else are we going to do next biennium? All the cool stuff that you all are doing in your states.
And huge shout out to Devin and Daniel for jumping in and starting to build out immigration practices at a nonprofit. I can only imagine how scary that is, but how absolutely necessary for the community in this moment. So hats off to you guys. Should we open it up for a little Q&A for the last 10 minutes? It seems like there's a lot of questions in the chat about traveling in Vermont. So I don't know if anyone feels like they could jump in to answer kind of general travel questions about the safety of traveling through Vermont or traveling through other states with Vermont driver privilege cards.
I can talk a tiny bit about that. I think that, as was mentioned earlier by Jill, some of the cases that we're seeing are folks whose navigation is failing or they're somehow finding themselves at the border. And that's definitely been a problem. Once you pass a certain point into Canada, Canada's not going to let you just turn around. They make you enter Canada and then turn back. So you are sort of engaging with the authorities. So I kind of wish I could put it on blast. If anyone is traveling, please stay away from the border. Do your best to not get lost. Print out MapQuest like it's the early 2000s and don't rely on your devices. It's really, really risky to go to the border if you're sort of not prepared for that. As far as general safety traveling, I mean, I think, ICE feels very prevalent and scary and big, but they have been here and continue to be here. Like ICE is just around. And I think there's certainly been some profiling of folks who are driving. I mean, it is scary and it is risky. And, I've had clients have fear of going to court in an unrelated case and ask if ICE will be there. And I have to say, I don't know. I can't guarantee they're not going to be there. So I think it is just a kind of risky time. But I think the concrete advice I can give is just have awareness of where the border is to Canada and just do your best to avoid that.
The only thing I was going to add quickly is just it's worth noting that no law enforcement agencies here in the state of Vermont have active 287G agreements. That and the fair and partial policing policies should offer some, not that great, there's nothing to worry about, but the fact that, folks can know that there's no law enforcement agencies that have that type of direct communication or, that where they're working directly with immigration authorities, that should be helpful to know. We have, any law enforcement agency that would want to do that has to get direct authority from the governor before they can enter in that type of agreement, which seems to have put enough political liability at his feet that hasn't been moving forward. So that paired with the fair and partial policing policy reduces the likelihood that a normal traffic stop, just for like speeding or something like that, will result in an immigration action. There's no guarantee, but just, throwing out one to make sure that folks knew there's no active 287Gs here in the state. So very different from our, friends over in New Hampshire, where it's every single state police officer. So just that, I thought that was worth noting.
Be careful of that border too, I guess, if you're driving through Vermont.
Yeah, on that point, and Vermont is very porous. We have deep connections in the Upper Valley with our New Hampshire neighbors and the Champlain Valley with our New York neighbors. A lot of Vermont detainees that VAAP has represented and partners have represented this year were people who were picked up in New York or had gone to visit a friend in New York. Often there's a little bit of an interstate travel element to someone who we find detained in Vermont. And it is a risk, right? There's some chat. If you're interested in this issue, you should scroll through and read some of the chat that's happened. But we do counsel folks, state-based laws are good in this state, in our state borders, right? And so be mindful about when you're crossing, not just out of country, but out of state. Now that there's Real ID Act requirements on flying, be thoughtful about how you're traveling. This has come up in our community organizing space around preparing for summer camp. I see some organizers on the call who are how do we help to prepare our parents to send their kids away to camp this summer or for educational programs or whatever. We do need to be thinking about these things. And I think information sharing is one way we can help keep people feeling freedom of movement, notwithstanding this ominous threat of the imminence of ICE enforcement against us. And there's some DMs I got that I'll just, offer to the group around us, how do we feel about traveling? And I'll offer to the group, I'm public about this, I'm a non-binary person, I have an X gender marker, and I constantly sue the government and run my mouth about Donald Trump. And so my wife asks very little of me. One thing she has asked is that I please don't travel. So as much as I love Montreal, and it's one of the primary things that drew me to Burlington, we've agreed that I'm not going to be traveling internationally for the rest of the administration. But it's a matter, not because it's a real legal threat, not because the Fourth Amendment doesn't exist. It does. We've also met U.S. citizens here in Vermont who have been unlawfully detained in violation of their Fourth Amendment rights by Border Patrol. It's just a matter of risk tolerance and protecting your peace. So you just think about the trade-offs, think about, case-by-case decision, and then there's some resources to help you think about how to assess your own risk and what you're comfortable with that we dropped in the chat.
I thought I saw a hand up. Andrea, did you have a question you wanted to ask?
I did, and Jill probably just answered that. Sorry for my dog. I have been worried. Sorry, my screen's up here. I have been worried. I'm due to be. This is the season when I start traveling back and forth to Odanak in Canada, based on my own personal activities here. Worried about that, and the fact that a year ago I've already been detained briefly once a year ago with no reason given as to why. And then when I asked, they just handed everything back to me and said I was free to go. And I still was given no reason. So I'm a little bit afraid. So that's why yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. And I realized that hearing your name again reminds me of another conversation we had. And Falco, can you say something very quickly about 4A and creating expectations of privacy in quasi-public spaces?
I can in terms of
People
talking
are
about,
interested in knowing how to maximize their chance of creating a magical force field that will keep ICE from intruding into their privacy.
Well, there's actually a webinar happening at this exact same time right now that our wonderful staff attorney Hillary Rich is putting on with Representative Becca Balance office on that exact topic. So I think we can, when we have a recording link, we can follow up on that. But high level, clear signage and expectations around public and non-public areas are very helpful. People do have Fourth Amendment protections. They should exercise them as much as they can. But yeah, I can follow up with a link to that when we have that and maybe get that out to the rest of the group. But is a salient topic, and I wish we'd better coordinate it internally and not put up two webinars at the same time. But that happens when you're doing a lot. Yes, exactly, Joe.
Do we have any last burning questions? Not, we can wrap up. Thank you all so much. Thank you to our panelists for sharing your knowledge and deep dedication to the immigrant community in Vermont. I think this was an incredible discussion, both for folks in Vermont as well as people outside of Vermont who are interested to know kind of what's happening with boots on the ground there. So, Jill, do you want to say anything to wrap us up?
Just thank you to all of the practitioners and advocates and community members and people with lived experience holding it down. Thank you for defending your rights so we all can enjoy them.
And thank you to Melinda for coordinating a lot of this in the back end too, another member of our state legislative committee. And thanks to AILA for giving us the space to host this.
Take care, folks.